Hello, welcome to our first podcast with my friend and colleague, Elaine Kicknosway. My name is Colleen Hele Cardinal. We're both 60 Scoop survivors who co-founded the National Indigenous Survivors of Child Welfare Network in 2014, which is otherwise known as the 60 Scoop Network, which is what we call it now. So I want my colleague and friend Elaine to introduce herself a bit, but first a little bit about me. So as you know, my name's Colleen. I'm a 60 Scoop adoptee, and this is how I identify myself in this context. Other folks use other descriptions such as scoopers, scoopies, foster cared, and so on. There's no right way, but this is what I use. I was removed from my parents in Edmonton, Alberta, who were from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, along with my two older sisters, and placed in foster care for a few years. And then we all had the experience of being trafficked through child welfare policies to a home in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which is approximately 3,000 kilometers from my traditional homelands. The family that adopted us were white European family who had their own biological son. So I'll let Elaine introduce herself and then we'll get into the podcast.
Bonjour, Ani, Tansi, Krekrewache Sego Elaine Dishnakans. My name is Elaine. Mangandota, my Wolf Clan, Pelicaneros and Donjba. I'm status under Peter Ballantyne Cree Nation out of Pelicaneros, and I've lived here on Algonquin territory since I was brought here when I was 14 by my non-Indigenous family. I'm what they call an AIM survivor, an Adopt an Indian survivor, and I was apprehended in 1969 at the height of when child welfare policies began in Saskatchewan in 1967. So in 1969, when I was on my little dirt road in Denair Beach or Ams Lake, a few of us were apprehended, but I remember just running from this dark car, this black car, and being hauled into the back seat. I am sibling of 13 side, and on my father's side, who's from Buffalo Narrows. I believe I have siblings over there. But I've been working, creating this constant place of how do we talk to each other and for each other and about each other in a good way. It comes from what they say, a good mind, the merging of brilliance, good-minded, because we recognize this this subject that's so personal to us, this place called the 60s Scoop. Sometimes we don't identify as scoopers. We don't we some people they don't like that word. Some of us are don't like to constantly be in a state of survivalism, like we've lived through, we're living with, we're living around. But it's important to have this conversation about where did we go? What happened? Because that's what the elders talk about. Where did we go? What happened? And where are we going? And I think, as Colleen and I have been doing this work, I was sharing earlier with her, it's been 11 years. We're in our 11th year now, but we've known each other for 13 years. So I think that's a significant number, the merging of the minds of 13 years and our 13th winter together because we met at around. It's a good place.
Yes.
Back to you, Colleen.
All right. Thank you, Elaine. So this is a first episode in a series that will address all different aspects of the 60 Scoop and everything you need to know or want to know. We hope to invite and engage 60 Scoop speakers who are also doing the work across the nation and share their lived experiences of living as a 60 Scoop person or a descendant of a 60 Scoop survivor. We hope to invite speakers who have insight into some of the topics that we'll be talking about. So we're hoping to have a series of conversations over the next year and really fleshing out these issues with different folks across the country. So once again, we have a series of questions, and this is an intro to the work that we started doing in Ottawa gosh, 11 years ago, 2014. And, I'm sure like in both of our hearts and minds, we wanted to do this larger and collectively, but we just didn't know how, and I don't think we realized how many other survivors were out here and out there doing or wanting, the work that we were offering. So I'm going to share a little bit about how we met and how we started doing this work. And then Elaine will share her version of how we met. And because we each have different points of view on how we came to this work, why we do this work, and why we continue to do this work. So for me, I moved from Sault Ste. Marie to Ottawa in 2011. I really wanted to do a documentary. Like I really felt my story was like something everybody should know, which I think every 60 Scoop survivor thinks too, that they want to share their story. They just don't know how. So I went and applied for a grant, a small grant. I think it was only like $500 from Saw Video. And I won. And so I really wanted to put together this little documentary. And what happened was it led me to meet other 60 Scoop survivors living here in Ottawa. And there's a lot, like hundreds. But at that time, there were specific ones that I met, Beverly McIver and Leslie Parlane and Elaine, and those are the ones that stick out to me the most at that time. And I said, hey, I want to do this documentary, not knowing anything about trauma-informed care, not knowing anything about coming to this work in a way that doesn't do any harm. And it was we learned a lot from that. I learned a lot about bringing people together and making sure people are safe, making sure that you do the trauma informed work. But initially, how I got started in this was to do a documentary. And you know what? I still haven't finished that documentary. I've literally been collecting footage since 2014. So what it's done is led us to, working with 60 Scoop survivors across Canada, overseas, and in the United States. And it's led to a lot of community building. So we've worked alongside some phenomenal people who are doing really good work out there, who are in good places where they're giving back. And we've also met, some really, um, some really hard stories that have stayed with us, and we think about those folks and we pray for those folks and we always keep them in mind when we come to ceremony, because sometimes this work is not a happy ending story for everybody. People are really struggling. So Elaine, will I share a little bit about how we met and how we started doing this work?
We
Oh,
were just kind of talking,
go ahead.
and my son was, I don't know, maybe he was 10 or 9 at the time. We had kind of met in between with the MMIW, with Families of Sisters in Spirit, when I first met you, but I didn't really talk with you, but I kind of knew how to, say hi, hello, how are you? And that night, I think I gave you a ride home. And then that was when we started, you were sharing about your documentary and that conversation. And then I recall later on, there was me, you, Beverly, and Leslie Buck, late Leslie Parling. And we met at a local coffee shop. And I remember I was kind of ticked because that was the first time I'd ever heard of a round table being done by the the MP. I think it was the MP in
Manitoba.
in Manitoba, with Eric Robinson, and they had released uh, in March 2014. So that's yeah, 11 years ago. This news article through CBC, and I was like, how did they choose? Like, how did they decide on how many? Because there's so many of us, and that conversation of like how sometimes people know the number and sometimes they don't. So in residential school, they were starting to come out with the numbers. We hadn't even heard about day school. And there's like this guesstimate of this many Indigenous children. And I remember I was like, how did they even decide on how who sat at the table at this round table, you know? And I was like, what about like that goes into that, what about us? We're from out west. I'm from Manitoba. I was born in Manitoba and raised partially in Saskatchewan in my childhood, but mainly raised over here in Ontario. And I was always surprised of how many of us from the west are from, living here in the region. But it was kind of neat because you were a survivor, Leslie Bob was a survivor, Beverly, but we were kind of cautiously talking, sharing just a little, like kind of like that circling, like how much can I share and is this okay to share? And building social skills with each other and building this consistency, like think I'll call you again. Okay, now we're Facebook friends. Now we're, being invited to take part in this documentary, and like it was new grounds of conversation that I'd never had really before,
Mm,
and it was like because they had started a group before in the 90s, and I wasn't there. I wasn't ready, and Leslie and Ba was with when I say Ba in the language, it means like they were here before, so we talk about them in their past, but knowing that, part of the within their passing, we talk about them in a good way, you know. I remember, you know, they had started a group, and I don't even know if it was called Sixties group. I don't even know if we had that wording yet in the 90s, but they invited me and I was like, no, no, that's a little too close for me. And got my heartbeat going. And I was like, that was too close for comfort for me. Even though we worked amongst each other, did ceremony amongst each other, danced a powwow amongst each other, went to the friendship center and gatherings. It was kind of like this still circling, like, how do we talk about this and really get down to how it's impacted? And your documentary, which I really hope that's going to get done, that place of, like this
mm,
honest talk about where have we been, what happened, and how are we holding each other in kindness
mm.
without this, because you're right, we can trigger each other too. We don't mean to, but we just do, you know. So that's part of, I didn't even know it would be like uh, called work because it was such a passion. Like, let's talk about this. How do we, when do we talk this?
Yeah.
How to talk about it, And here we, 11 years later, we're still talking about taking a different step. That's cool.
Yeah, your sound keeps cutting out a little bit. It's probably this thing here. That's okay. We'll keep
Yeah.
there. Yeah, just don't move too much.
Okay.
Yeah, it's true. Like at the time, I think we were all very timid of each other. We were all excited, but we were all, as soon as we got triggered, we all scattered from each other.
Hmm.
We have a
Yeah.
lot of unresolved childhood trauma, right? And trust issues and all these different barriers when we come together. So it's it's so important to talk about when we come together in these spaces and what it's like for all of us. Um, and we'll get into that. So I want to talk a little bit about how we came to know about the 60s scoop. It just one day it wasn't just the 60s scoop. And, that it's a term that everybody knows because I myself did not know that I was part of a larger project of taking of children and assimilating them into these white Eurocentric homes. I actually thought it was really special. I thought I remember, I was so assimilated and so colonized that I was proud that I grew up in a white home. And I used to, say I was adopted and I was raised by white people. And because that's the way you're socialized to be, to be proud of it. And it wasn't until I went to college in 1998, no, 2000, I'm sorry, where I started learning about residential school, the 60s scoop. Like I had never heard of that until then. And I was just like, it really blew me away that I'd never heard of it before then. That nobody in my family, my biological or my adoptive family, had heard of it or told me about it. I don't think they knew either. So it was shocking and enraging and empowering at the same time to know that I was part of something. But also, the first question for me was, where are all these other adoptees? If there's thousands of them, because the number they quoted all the time is 20,000. They still use that number, but we know now that it's higher than that. And I'm like, okay, if there's 20,000, like, where are all of them? I want to find them. And I think that's been driving me since then. What about you? What was the first time you heard about the 60 scoop, Elaine?
I didn't even know it was called a 60 scoop. Like it was like, you know how you're kind of going along, and then people are like using that word, using that style of, oh, now you're not just child welfare survivors, now you're called 60s group survivors.
Mhm.
So it was a gentle transition related to how we're called. And I remember people like, we're not survivors, we're not this, we're not that. And others were like, oh yeah, I am. So it was like it was a hit or miss, right? And then the government started calling, and then the newspaper. So it was really and then I just kind of adapted it into my language because that's what we do. We adapt, we assimilate, we we go into that place whether we're we kind of try and be cool with the cool kids, and keep that place of keeping up,
Mhm.
we're keeping up. And I always wondered, like, if we were even given the option, what would we call ourselves? Like, would we call ourselves that? Because it was termed from Patrick Johnson or some other lady, right?
Bridget Moran.
Yeah, like like
It's not our
would right. So that's again language that has been placed on us.
right.
And
Yeah.
so we just absorbed, adapted. I guess that's what we call ourselves. But I always wonder, would we really call ourselves that? Like would we? Or
I personally don't like the term.
mhm,
Like when I think of the 60 scoop, it's just like, I know it's not my term, but it's something that we've, um, that's how we identify ourselves now because it's largely used by the colonial government,
mhm.
white authors. It's all over the internet, these copy and pasted terms of what the 60 scoop is. But, for us, I would, I'd say we were child trafficked through child welfare policies. But how do you put that down? That's not very catchy, right?
I always think, like I would explain it to, other families, like, oh, you're adopted. Oh, but that family's white. You're the Indian, right? And that was just what they called us back in the day, right? Even ourselves, for myself, I even called myself that. And nowadays, you're right. Some of the terminology of what we grew up is derogatory or, racist, right? And so it's readjusting the language. I didn't even think I was a foster care survivor, right? Or child welfare survivor, right? And even that terminology of welfare, right? Like they put child and welfare together, like it's just like, oh, and some words are shame based, right? Like
Doesn't make
Everyone,
sense, right? Because
no,
it's like child welfare, but we weren't well, and our welfare was not well.
no, that's right. And people weren't in the best interest of our childhood. So I always, if we had like a contest, I don't know, or a call out, like what would we really call ourselves in good ways that we would all recognize, oh, that's me too, right? One that because we have the different terminologies in our language, our different terminology of attachment, different terminology of the returning home to each other, or
Yeah,
calling each other home, or singing each other home, or just like you were sharing earlier, like we pray for each other even when we're challenged.
yeah. So the 60 scoop word, I remember talking with our good friend Leroy, and he grew up in community. He grew up knowing his identity with his cousins and all his family. And so the 60 scoop was not something that he was really aware of. And explaining to him, like, we were all taken from our communities and raised with white people, and we lost our culture. And he just really could not understand what losing your culture meant, or not even being identified with it. So it was a lot of conversations to explain, like, the scope of it. It's not just about, like, oh, they were raised somewhere else. This is so much more than that. This is like assimilation, brainwashing, and displacement, like large displacement. So we're gonna get into that. But
I remember they used to call us split feathers too. And I don't know if that's like a 60s, a Saskatchewan thing. Like
mhm,
I remember they like at the friendship center when I was little, and
mhm,
it's not like I went a lot, but they were like, oh, and then there's some split feathers. I
mhm.
was like, what does that mean? Because I was just a kid, right? So it was a lot of, again, our own people, not faulted, but they weren't explaining how did we get to be living with white families when other children that you saw, and you have to recall, like, there was residential school going on there too. Being raised in Saskatchewan for myself, there was residential school there, you know. So there was still such a loss of childhood, children being raised within their home and community, culture, what they say, a cultural base, you know.
Yeah,
And I know that there's lots of ongoing conversation that have not been addressed, or some people, and even our own, like with those of us that have lived through it, like we're like, is it time for us to talk? Are we allowed to talk? Is it time? Like, who do we talk to? Like, do people, like, would they be interested? Are people really interested? Because we're not just a check mark that says, oh, okay, we talked about 60s scoop and we don't have to talk about them again. We talk about it almost every day, interrelated with the long-term effects.
well, I can tell you after doing this work for so long that I'm actually sick of the term 60 scoop,
Mm,
but it's the only thing I know.
mm,
So um that kind of brings us into why we got into this work, like what
mm,
drives us to to do this work unpaid, without support, without resources. We get up and we do this work regardless of if we don't get grants, regardless if we have no money. We don't have any money to do. I'm paying for this myself. So, like, this is the kind of work that is so necessary. And, I think about our loved ones we've lost, that were
mm.
our brothers, our sisters, our aunts, I mean, our uncles and aunts, and our late friend, Leslie
Yeah.
Ba,
Mhm.
and our late friend, Dan Parlo. And there's so many more, hundreds, thousands.
My late brother, Paul,
Yeah.
you know,
And they never got to do this work. They never got to tell their story, share their story, or recover from their childhood.
or be
So,
a part of the even consideration to be a part of the settlement
or the gatherings,
or the
or
gatherings. Mm,
there's so many gatherings coming up now. So, when we started doing this work, You, me, Beverly, Leslie Bob. It was just about a need and a common need to come together with other survivors and learn from each other and meet each other. And like, what does that look like having us all together in one space? What would that look like? It was so terrifying,
It was.
but it was
And to
like,
be safe in our own action and reaction.
it was terrifying the
You
night before
know,
gathering, our first gathering. Like, what's good? What if we all start fighting?
I was thinking, no one's going to show up.
Yeah,
We,
that's what I
we
thought
got all
too.
this food, we fundraised, like, but it wasn't just a we thing. It was like, who's going to show up? Like,
That's the other thing, like the uncontrollable element, right? Well, who's going to show up? What's going to happen if something goes wrong, or if somebody
mhm,
gets triggered, or if somebody comes under the influence? Like there's so many unanswered. And you know what? Like so many people came. We had over 102 people apply
yeah,
to, and they
yeah,
came every their own dime. Nobody
yeah,
paid because they wanted to gather, because they wanted to be in a space with other survivors, because they wanted to be seen and heard and validated. And we, in that gathering, just kind of was the jump off for everything else. We're like, well, we got to
yeah.
have a one, you know.
Like, we're doing this again?
Yeah, we're doing it again. And we had money, and we
Yeah,
had to fundraise. We had to find money. We had some great, awesome people in this community, most of them non-Indigenous, who stepped up and helped.
yeah,
They said, hey, what do you need? Well, how can we help? What can we do? We can come help set up chairs. We can come help take down chairs. We can clean up. We can cook. We
yeah,
can buy. Here, have some money. Here, have some donations. People just wanted to see us be successful
yeah.
and
And
grateful.
we didn't even know them. Like, I didn't know them, you
One of
know?
the people that helped us a lot was the late James.
Yeah.
He really helped us with fundraising for karaoke at with China Doll and at the Shanghai restaurant.
That
He
was the best.
he was amazing. He was such a good ally, and he would come out and just work.
Yeah.
He would just come out, set up chairs, take down chairs. What do you need? What can I do? He was an amazing ally, and there's so many like him.
Yeah. Help with the raffles, you know.
And I'd say like we had very little support from the Indigenous community here in Ottawa. Very little, if any. I think APTN was the only Indigenous person or group that really donated to us by giving giveaway items. But that drive to come together, to share our common experiences, and to just be seen by each other, to be with each other. And what we learned is that we all have very similar stories.
Mhm.
We didn't experience abuse. We experienced loss of identity. We still had these really funny stories about our adoptive parents. The weird experiences of growing up in a white home, or the awful experiences we had, when we experienced racism and so on. So,
Mhm.
and it was just like times being like a child all over again, to feel safe and accepted. And you know what? We've had a lot of bad experiences too. We've experienced some lateral violence, and we've experienced some,
Cyberbullying.
yeah, it's all part of the journey though, right? Like
Mhm.
you learn yourself what you can tolerate, where you're at in your own personal healing, your own development, and what you need to work on, and kind of point the finger back at yourself and say, okay, how much of this is my responsibility and how much of this is your responsibility? So I've learned a lot over the time.
Mhm. Yeah.
Uh,
And this whole place where it's, that reminder, like, you're right, we're gonna make mistakes. And you're right. Sometimes they say in public eye or being watched, like, how are you doing? Like, and sometimes that whole place of, like, because it's attachment you're talking about, you're talking about something that's real close to you, and sometimes people don't like how you talked about it. And people are like, and I'm okay, like that's how it drives me. It's just like I want to be in a good way to find us all, but
Mm.
not not be at that place of expecting them wanting to be found either. But I always wonder, like, how many of us are buried without our namesake and not even knowing our name
Mm.
because our names got changed and like we were put in newspapers and Child Today and on radio and TV, as children, and that's what I call being exploited,
Yeah.
and how those long-term effects of when we talk and try to be with each other in a good way to reassure, you're right, I might make a mistake, and we have to recognize this place of gracefulness to not hurt each other. We've had a lot of hurt, and sometimes it's our go-to because it's so familiar,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, we've learned a lot. And you know, we've had 6 national gatherings here in Ottawa over the past 11 years, actually 10. The last gathering we'd had was 2022.
Yeah.
And that was a smaller gathering because we've learned that smaller numbers are easier to manage. We to bring everybody in who requests. It doesn't work out too well.
Mhm.
It's a lot of people to manage, 2 people with me and you.
Yeah.
And, a lot of planning. And, when something goes wrong, we really feel it. Like we had a tornado in 2018 and we lost electricity, we lost water because the water pumps ran on electricity. So there was a fear that we might starve or we have
Toy-
no water.
we had to, go outside and use the toilet.
There was a little bit of a panic, and some people actually left. They left and went back out west because they were so afraid that, you know, something bad was going to happen. So I think we learned from that too, to have an emergency plan for a tornado. Who knew we'd have a tornado that day though, right? But
Emergency preparedness at all times.
it was the end of September. Who knew
No,
we'd have a tornado? But um, we learned from that, and we've made some amazing friends, and that we're still connected to this day. And we've worked with many, many knowledge keepers from all across Canada, not just like here in Ottawa. And
yeah, yeah.
it's been an amazing journey. So let's talk a little bit about some of the projects that we've worked on and that we've taken part in and that we're working towards. And one of the things I think was our first one was the Debwewin
Yeah.
project, the Legacy of Hope Foundation.
Well, even how we got that name, I think that's important.
Yeah,
How we originally got that name, because that was our first namesake for our first gathering.
yeah,
And that was where we got that name from Claudette Commanda. We went to the leadership in the territory and we were talking and we were sharing, who we were and what we were going to do and what we hoped for. And she brought that name forward, Bajewin or Begawin, like we were saying it wrong at one point.
yeah.
You got it.
We were saying Begawin.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But that's that English version of reading it.
yeah.
And even though you and I were right there and she said it,
Mhm.
we still made the mistake. And
Yeah,
that's just like being present and grounded while you're doing this work because you're excited, you're scared. And then that place of the first gathering's namesake
yes.
was that
And
went to lead on to other national.
yeah, and we still use it in a lot of our ceremonies. Bejiwan means to come home. And we're
Yeah.
talking about not a physical home, but home to here, home to ourselves, to who we are, to our identity, to a community of 60 Scoop survivors. So it meant a lot to us. And we lent that name to the Bejiwan Truth Telling Project, Truth
Mm-hmm.
Telling 60 Scoop. So, we had created a grid where we made sure that First Nation, Métis, Inuit folks were recognized, that Two-Spirit, man, woman were recognized, and that we had a person come from out west, a person from north, a person from south, a person from overseas. And that's how we made sure that we were having a good bunch of group of people that would be coming to share their story for this project. So it was, I'm very proud of the work we did and the ceremony we did for that project. Um, that was one of our first projects. So you can look that up on the Legacy of Hope Foundation website.
And even knowing that we did the recommendations,
The
it was we
recommendation.
we were asked to take the lead, the paperwork part and the gentle kindness of, taking the lead to reassure survivors and supporters. This would be a good idea. We stand behind it, you know.
The other major project that we initiated myself was the GIS mapping the 60 scoop diaspora, which was basically, started off as an idea to visualize the 60 scoop on a map. And, I had went to a gathering for immigrants and newcomers to Canada. It was called No One is Illegal. It's a very grassroots organization that supports refugees, migrants, new people that are coming to our country that need support. And they had taken a white sheet and had put a map on it. They had drawn a map on it, huge, and they had given people very brightly colored yarn. And they were asking them to put their point where they started at and where they were in the world, or where they've been in the world and where they are now. It was so striking to see all the different colors of thread across the world. And I'm like, that is what we need. But I'm like, I don't want it to be on a sheet. I would like it to be digital. I would like for the world to see this on a digital platform. But finding funds for it was difficult. And finding people who could actually bring it to life and make it sophisticated was a chore too. But we ended up finding the folks at Geoforms. So John Corbett and Nick Blackwell helped bring that to life. And it took months and years actually for us to find the funding to get it going, to make it as sophisticated as it is. And it's still a work in progress. But what it was a platform for survivors to show where they've been taken from and to in the world, a platform for them to share their story or anything they wanted about, their displacement, or nothing at all, or a place for people to find other biological family members. So, it's a work in progress. It'll always be a work in progress because the more survivors that use it, the more populated it becomes and more representative of the displacement. So that's another project that we took part in. We've been involved in several research initiatives with Margot Christensen, Dr. Raven Sinclair, and our colleague and friend, Dr. Natasha Stewart,
Mhm.
who we've talked about the carceration of 60 scoop survivors and the criminalization of 60 scoop survivors because of their experiences in foster care and adoption, and how young they've been criminalized and how many times they've been criminalized throughout their life. So we took that project across Canada to meet with survivors and talk about, like, what was your first time that you were criminalized, and was it when you were in foster care, and almost every single survivor shared that they'd experienced abuses in their home, which led them to run away, which led them to, some kind of criminal behavior. Survivors sometimes surviving, whether it's through, stealing, whether it was through sex work, all these different ways that we have to cope on our own, living on the streets and so on. So it was really a heart project when it came to talking about all these different ways that our relatives end up in the system and are continually staying in the system, and how much of a project it is by the state, a money-making project. With Margot Johansson, we had participated in research to talk about the wages of care and how child welfare is actually a system that extracts children to make money for the state. So it's a money-making business. And she writes a wonderful article about it. It's very hard to read, but it's also very, very detailed about, this is an ongoing project of taking Indigenous children for residential school, for day school, but then for foster care, for adoption homes, and it's still going on to this day. So, and the next project, go ahead.
Well, I remember, like we were advocating even at the, Parliament Hill, at the media, like we were taking steps to talk about, these different places of awareness and awareness campaigning.
Yes.
And also that's where Margot is great at really helping the media really readjust their wording when they spoke of us.
Yeah. Margot was great at championing the media, but also really calling them out in the way their behavior was, on the language they used when they were talking about Indigenous people and about 60 scoop survivors. One of the things I remember, they talked about the so-called 60 scoop, which we were infuriated that they used
Yep.
that language. So
Yep.
she talked to them and said, listen, this is unacceptable. You need to rewrite this article. The other words were just wording like that is unacceptable for talking about Indigenous children, or the ways that we were taken or given up by our parents. So, which
Yeah.
puts the blame back on Indigenous parents as like, oh, here's my child, take my child, like it's still the 60 scoop. It's still, you're still taking those children into care. You're still trafficking them. You're still, putting them into non-Indigenous homes when they have homes they can go to, whether it's an Indigenous auntie, Indigenous uncle, or grandparents. They just didn't at the time.
And the constant narration that we were not being watched, we were not being cared for, that we were not being loved.
Well, even if we weren't, there's a reason for it, right? So instead of putting money and resources into our First Nation communities and Métis settlements and Inuit communities, they just took us, and they didn't put any resources back into making sure that our parents recovered from residential schools harms, our grandparents, whatever. They just took us. So we
A
can
lot
go
of
into this really hardcore.
lack of information, the constant lack of information, and the constant lack of accountability, interrelated with the agencies, the workers, we have to say it, the RCMP, the
Yeah.
Indian agents, the Indian hospitals. Like there's a whole bunch of other narrations that are not included. There seems to be this constant place of blame this part and blame the child.
Yes.
And I'm just like, how does that happen? How do we get blamed for our childhood?
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of, there's still, and I'm going to get into that with our next topic of why we need podcasts, because we're going to talk about why our communities are not talking about this. Why are people not talking about this? I understand there's a lot of hurt, right? But there's a time to talk about this, just like residential schools. Residential schools and day school survivors, they got their time to speak and talk about what happened to them. And it's our time to talk about what's happened to us, what happened to our parents, and what happened to our grandparents when we were taken. It's so important. So that's just going to segue us right into, wrapping up this podcast with talking about why we feel there's a need to create this podcast. And some of the topics we're going to talk about are the lack of information across Turtle Island about the 60 scoop. A lot of people don't know that the 60 scoop was not just national in Canada. This was a global child welfare project where we were taken all over the world. Even our government doesn't know this. Our own First Nation, Métis, and Inuit leadership do not know this. And surprised when they hear it. They're like, what? You were taken there? Like, they don't really understand the context of being taken and raised in isolation with white folks. Um, the lack of accountability. Many 60 Scoop survivors who are doing this work across the nation talk about an inquiry. How come we never got an inquiry? Why are there so many unresolved issues related to who's responsible for what happened to us? Yes, we got a settlement, but that settlement only dealt with loss of culture. And it was only based on one small sentence in a policy. I think we deserve more accountability from the federal government, from the provincial governments, from whoever benefited and profited from our displacements. So the other topic that can be hard to talk about is our complicated biological and adoptive family relationships. And, some survivors are in places where they can talk about this because they don't have to worry about retribution or, hearing about it from their adoptive families or from their biological families. It's hard to talk about our different relationships, and that's okay. We're going to talk about it. The other thing is reunions. They're not all a happy ending story. It's complicated to go back to your community and when you don't know anything about your community or yourself or what's happened, why you were taken away. Like there's a lot of stuff that happens. And then the identity crisis we all experience.
Or uh, you hear it now more often, the imposter syndrome, you
Mhm.
know. And I always like wonder, like I must have that or I must have had that, or maybe there's points of vulnerability that I still do have that, but it doesn't creep up as much, you know. Um, and
I
so
should
there's
experience.
different levels of where we are each with each other,
Yes.
you know, and it's that constant, I think, definite reassurance of we're on the right pathways with each other. We're on the right path and breaking out of that isolation, breaking out of that place of recognizing, like some do go home, some didn't go home, some didn't get the opportunity, some didn't know that they could. Like there's such a diversity. And still finding out today, like there's still reunions happening today. It's not just from the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. Like we're at all different areas of how and when we returned or when we were called to say, I want to go home.
I just had a friend in New Zealand who just reunited with his biological family for the first time in his whole life. Hopefully we can get to see him when we go to New Zealand this year. But the other issues we want to talk about are attachment issues. Why we have such a hard time with relationships and with forming meaningful attachments, like secure attachments with other human beings. We're going to talk about that. And the other subjects is we get lumped in with residential school survivors and day schools, like we were all, you know, the same thing happened to us. The only thing that really is the same is the loss of culture and the loss of identity and the abuses. But when it comes to the differences between 60 Scoop survivors and residential schools, in some ways there's a lot of differences, and we're going to talk about that. The lack of attention that 60 Scoop survivors receive nationally and internationally is basically none, and a deliberate attempt to not include us in projects, yet collecting funding from us that are designated for us. There are major organizations out there collecting funds, but not really involving 60 Scoop survivors like they should. And genealogy, everybody loves genealogy. So we're going to have some experts come on and talk to us about genealogy, how to trace your family trees. And is there any topics that I missed, Elaine?
I think even how we're returning to ceremony, how
Mhm.
we're returning to the powwow circle, how we're incorporating our language back,
Cultural
how
safety.
cultural safety, like what does coming back within different spaces look safety wise, and who and what and where and when and how,
Yeah.
and really catching our own sweeping statements of, oh, it must all be like this, like even catching that narration, right? Because sometimes in different homes, and it's also breaking down that concept of, because of that isolation, that belief that, it has to be led this way, but there's so many variety spaces of how it can really be. Some regained their language, some didn't. Some went back to ceremony, some don't want to go to ceremony.
Yeah.
Some don't even know that they can.
Yeah.
Those different rites of passage of blanketing, or even moccasins, or earrings, or beadwork or not beadwork, or the reality is, I was born an Indian. I cannot take that away. I will always be an Indian.
Yeah.
And talking about what happened, but making it, unique to the commonality that brings us together, that says, I want to hear that too. I hear that, and that makes me feel like I belong.
Yeah.
So there's and even topics we're not even sure that we didn't even, it's not yet come, because we haven't been told. Because sometimes people will say, hey, I want to talk about that. Oh, okay, we didn't even know we could talk about that. Okay, let's bring it in.
One of the things that I think that comes up a lot now that we have our own children is intergenerational trauma, and
Yep.
how our adoption and our trauma has impacted our children and our children's children. We need to do that. So I'm just going to start closing up and just let you know that we created this podcast with special guests to raise the national dialogue, to raise awareness. It's survivor led, and we want to build community across the country, across the world. We have survivor friends all over the place.
Mhm.
Uh, we hope to feature guests if you have a guest that you want to recommend. But we want to invite you all to give your input as well, and to ask questions, and to get your answers. So thank you for joining us. And we will be back again with another recorded podcast. And we'll say goodbye for now.
Thank
Bye,
you so much. Damapi, have a good day.